So good morning to all. Thank you very much for inviting us as well as the speakers today. I'm very pleased to make this presentation with Christina, who is working for UNICEF. We will be discussing today the performance actually on social sector spendings against the Sustainable Development Goals that we use the acronym SDGs, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This is actually coming in the framework of a regional analysis that the EU and UNICEF have been doing over 21 countries in East Asia and the Pacific. We will present you the trends from national government spending, but also looking obviously at centralized level where data was available. So some of you may wonder why EU and UNICEF are partnering on this. So basically the reason is, as you know, the European Union is providing budget support to more than 100 countries in the world, usually targeting a specific sector. In Asia and Pacific, our focus is mainly on education, nutrition, could be agriculture, energy, climate. These are the main priority for us. But when we do budget support, we also look at how your government is funding the policy we're supporting. And when you look at social sector spending, we were actually seeing a number of gaps on how basically your ministries and at local level, you're able to generate data to confirm that basically the policy objective of your governments are realistically achievable. So the purpose of this EU UNICEF public finance facility was really to generate additional evidence on sector level where we have a common interest. So we focus mainly on social sector spending, education, health, WASH, which means water and sanitation, and nutrition related issues under this partnership. Of course, this is fully embedded in the achievement and aligned with the SDGs agenda. And I'm just going to give now 1 minute the floor to Christina so that she can also explain the mandate of UNICEF on the public finance related agenda.
Thank you, Damien. In the Convention on the Rights of Children, in Article 4, all the governments that are signatories to the convention have subscribed to provide the maximum resources to implement all the rights of children. So what we do under the public finance facility is also aligned with these efforts of the government to see how they can maximize their resources. I would like to continue with a reminder for all of us of the ambition that was set back in 2015 with the adoption of SDGs. All the countries that are signatories to the SDGs basically confirmed that they would cover all the issues that concern all of us, that the ambition is to leave no one behind, and also to ensure that we establish a safe, sustainable, and harmonious planet for all of us. Under the public finance facility and the analysis that we are presenting today, we covered certain number of the SDGs, and that's notably SDG 1 with the focus on reduction of poverty, both monetary and multidimensional, as well as establishment of sustainable social protection systems, and support to the governments to spend the maximum of their resources for essential social services, health, education, and social protection. We also focused on SDG 3, which is health and well-being, SDG 4, the quality of education, and SDG 16, which focuses on the sustainable systems and strong institutions for peace and justice.
So the ambition was set with very ambitious targets and benchmarks to be achieved by 2030. But of course, on its way, we were impacted by several headwinds, what we call, or external factors. COVID was one of them. On the short term, you can see on the graph there, we could actually imagine some positive outcomes when it comes to reduction of pollutions or greenhouse gas emissions. But actually, the COVID also had on environment some deterrent effects, especially when it comes to waste management station being shut down or operating at a slower pace, while we have been using a lot of single-use plastic, for instance, which has deteriorated the targets on environment SDG. Now, focusing on social sectors, because this is the main focus of our presentation. If you look at the different reports prepared by the World Bank or by UNDP, you can see that about 150 to 250 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty, which obviously impacts SDG 1 on ending poverty, on stunting for number 2, or nutrition related for zero hunger, health, but also education, SDG 4. Why? Because the closure of school, especially in Asia, has been actually compared to other regions in the world as the longest period, which has, of course, impacted the learning outcomes for all boys and girls. Indirect impact is also related to the fact that your government had to reprioritize the budget allocations to rebuild the economy in response to the COVID, which has also, for instance, diverted some investment that were needed on the wash sector. If you look at currently, you have 2 billion people who do not have access to safe drinkable water, and 3.6 billion people who have no access to safe sanitation. So, of course, COVID has been a big impact on the implementation of the SDG, but you have also additional external factors that actually the Director General from Korea has been mentioning also in his speech. These are graphs taken from various sources of the IMF, where you see the Russian invasion of Ukraine has also spiked the commodity prices on food and energies, which has pushed later your government's responses in terms of fiscal measures introduced. Interesting to note that for Asia emerging market economy and developing economy, you have a mix of tax and spending measures, especially. And this can, of course, represent a substantive cost in terms of public finance as a share to GDP, where on the lower middle chart, you can see how much it represents for Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. In terms of type of measures introduced, of course, the vast majority are temporary, because it's just responding to a shock, and also untargeted, because poverty is also dynamic by nature, so you want to address and protect the most vulnerable as much as you can. I think one thing that is not mentioned in this line is very important to focus. This is really the immediate responses we've been provided in 22 to tackle all the food prices increase and energy, as well as inflation, but it doesn't take into account also two important parts of your fiscal response. One is the demographic composition of your country. Some of you have very aging population, which also put pressure on your finances. And the second point is, of course, the climate shock responses. On the right side chart, just to make a link with what Christina later will talk about on the type of measures that are being introduced. When you focus really on social sector spending, you realize actually that by having a very small share of permanent fiscal measures, it doesn't really bring your performance towards resilience and sustainability over time. So there is a need to actually step up investments on social sectors. Just to remind as well, a little slide on debt, because it has been a hot topic also over the last years. If you look at 2019, 2021, there have been in Asia an increase of about 12% of point to GDP of contraction of debt, which was mainly done for primary deficits and output losses compensations. Of course, the subsequent fiscal measures that you have been endorsing have also contributed to continue contracting debt. Here, I think the main message is also to remind that having very strong mechanism and debt monitoring system is very important, as we see a rising trends of country being in high debt distress. We can see from the right side chart that actually the trends towards government debt to GDP is continuing to increase from 2017 to 22, which of course require close monitoring, as investments will be needed also for the achievement of the SDG. Now, considering all the headwinds that had lead us to this, Christina, just tell us, please, where do we stand with the current implementation of the SDG?
So in terms of progress towards 2030, the latest report from UNESCAP basically tells us that we are halfway on the way. We are only at 14%. Of implementing the progress of implementing the SDGs. There are notably certain goals that are on track and have achieved a bigger progress, such as Goal 7 and Goal 9. But the goals that we are looking at, notably poverty, health, education, are still lagging behind and need additional efforts, new and innovative approaches, and also partnerships in order to be achieved by 2030.
So we know now that the level of actually achievement is quite lagging behind. So what is next? That's the question. So when you look actually of an interesting IMF discussion note on SDG financing, for Asia, the estimation of the calculation was that we need to invest approximately 10% of additional spending to GDP on an annual basis. So here, when we talk about also in this conference about fiscal decentralization, there is clearly ways to see and zoom where we can actually generate additional resources for funding needs and responding to people. Here, important just to say that this calculation is actually focusing on a few SDGs only: health, education, roads, electricity, and water and sanitation, because they're considered to have a positive spillover effect on actually leading to achieving other SDGs. Of course, when you hear that you need to spend at least more than 10% on an annual basis to pay to GDP, that sounds quite unrealistic to achieve your SDG. So obviously, you can change the next slide. Yeah, we will be looking at different way of funding. I mean, all of them, I guess you're very familiar. One is obviously based on your actual resources and limited fiscal space, you will need to reprioritize your policy priority. Here, when we talk about avoiding the zero-sum game, is literally like if you decide to increase allocation in one sector, is not basically to be done at the expense of another sector, but rather to look at the entire portfolio of investments and then, pick and focus on critical investments for maximizing results. On efficiency game, I mean, Christina will go a bit more, but you have an example here on the type of calculation that can be done looking at a sector. Here is an education on primary education, that by providing maybe a smaller input, you can still actually achieve the same output and then reuse this money to more critical investments. Tax to GDP ratio, we have been talking also in the opening remarks, the trends, I would say, in Asia for many years, some countries have been struggling in generating enough revenues to match basically the needs for expenditure. Here we see, of course, opportunities for increasing tax compliance, strengthening tax administration, but also expanding the tax base, and see how in the fiscal decentralization relationship, the resources also generated by the subnational level can contribute to increase that.
So in order to discover the picture of where the countries stand in terms of social sector spending, specifically for health, education, and social protection, we collected the data for the years between 2017 and 2021, and currently there is an update for fiscal years 22 and 23 for 21 countries, 12 in East Asia, 5 in the Pacific, and 4 in South Asia. So apart from covering the fiscal space analysis, which Damien already parts of it presented, we also covered allocation analysis. We also covered execution, equity, credibility, and transparency to the extent possible, and to the extent that there is data from the countries. One of the methods that, and we'll be presenting this in a minute, that we applied to establish the gaps was benchmarking, and that's benchmarking against regional and global thresholds that have been established for the respective sectors. For education, this is 15% of the total government budget. For health, it's 15% of the annual budget of the government. And for social protection, since there are no global regional benchmarks, we are using the costing done by ILO and UNICEF together on the investment needed by the governments for establishing the social protection floor with 4 essential social protection schemes needed to cover the population.
So if we look at the benchmarks for education, we said that actually government spending needs to be in the range between at least 15% of government expenditure, between 15 to 20%. Now we see from the graph and the performance of those countries in the region that actually most of them are, very few of them needs to have crossed the benchmark of 15%, and very few actually are moving towards it. We can see that the overall, if you make a rough calculation on how much money is allocated to education for the entire region, we still reach a 14.3%. So it's not that far from the minimum threshold. But of course, the situation varied drastically from one country to another. Here, I think Malaysia can be mentioned as a good example for showing consistent prioritization to the education sector. Indonesia, we see that before COVID, they have actually reached the benchmark, but there have been a reversal trends after COVID. And then I think Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam are the one following just right after.
Apart from the benchmarking and establishing the gaps even before COVID, what we also tried to do was to see what's happening with the sectoral budget trends year to year. What were the changes? And just to explain the methodology that we used, basically, if in 2 consecutive years the sector is showing increase, then we consider this to be resilient behavior. That's the top right quadrant. If the countries are showing increase in 1 year and decrease in the next, that's something that we consider a temporary adjustment, and that's the lower right quadrant. If the countries experience decrease and then increase, we consider this slow adjustment. And if we have 2 consecutive years with decrease, then we consider deprioritization. So what happens with what we've observed when looking at the year-to-year changes between 2019 and 2013? During the first year of COVID, we saw very clear trends of deprioritization of education. And this trend is slowly, the countries are slowly getting out of this trend towards slow or temporary adjustment. But still, all the learning loss that countries experienced during COVID cannot be met, cannot be addressed if the countries don't move and don't accelerate their investments towards the resilience quadrant. That's something very important for us to bear in mind. One of the good examples that we saw in the region is the case of Indonesia, that has managed to keep the investments between 15 and 20%, of course, with some fluctuations, but also progressively moving towards positive changes in some of the benchmarks under SDG 4, which is the completion rate of lower secondary at both sexes, and also the lowering rate for adolescents, out of schools adolescents at lower secondary age at both sexes. Of course, there is always what we could wish for more to accelerate fully the achievement of the SDG 4, but we thought that this is a good example that could be shown to all of us.
On decentralization, as we have been discussing also during the opening remarks, actually the level of fiscal decentralization is quite high for your region, but this didn't really, I would say, match with the level of data available for subnational level. I mean, in the design, and when we prepared this regional analysis for all social sectors, there was a real struggle on data availability and budget execution report at subnational level. But if you look at overall aggregate spending for subnational level, actually your region in Asia is spending more than the global average. And compared to EU, you spend in terms of public spending 35% roughly, while the EU spend 26%. But if you compare to GDP, the EU devote more more funds compared to Asia, between 11 versus 9.6. If you look at the trends, China remains, I think most of its budget is actually devoted on education to subnational level, over 95%, plus I think Vietnam is around 92% as well. Allocation in general is very stable over the years, as we can see here. Here, I think there is one line we don't see for the graph, it was Vietnam, but it's there. Mongolia and Lao, which are not visible here, but here we see that there is also an increasing trend towards subnational level on education, but there is also volatility, which means that the allocations from one year to another can vary by plus minus 20% or 10%, depending on the year. This level, of course, of fiscal decentralization for education varies very much in the region. Thailand, for instance, is about 90%, so Philippines is close to 15%. If you look now at the benchmark for health, we need to go for 15% of government expenditure for supporting SDG 3, notably. Here we see the picture. Of course, we are all a bit far from the benchmark. The average for the region is 6.46% of government spending, so it's quite low. But this doesn't necessarily translate the very good progress in Asia that has been done, especially on maternal, newborn, and child health. For instance, with the reduction of children with under 5 mortality rates decline. Here, in terms of performance, Mongolia is leading, and I think it's followed by Malaysia and not Mongolia. Yeah, Mongolia, sorry, is leading, and is followed by Malaysia and Thailand. Of course, the focus on this is to have sustainable investments to at least maintain the positive result that I just mentioned on children health. For primary health services, actually, is needed in a real focus on investment on this front.
Health is one of the sectors that really showed a very high level of prioritization and resilience during the COVID years. However, as we move away from the COVID period, for some countries, resilience remains, but especially during the last 2 fiscal years, we can see that countries are actually moving towards temporary adjustment. This is important for us to bear in mind, since we still need to prioritize for the region investments in primary healthcare, and also to prioritize those areas such as immunization, which were maybe delayed or a little bit put aside during the COVID period. One of the good examples in the region that we wanted to showcase, of course, alongside with others, is Thailand, mainly because of 2 reasons. One is Thailand, over the past decade, has managed to rise up on the Universal Health Coverage Index between 41% in 2000 to 83% in 2019. This has translated in achievement of a lot of the outcomes for children and for mothers in terms of child and maternal health, and overall increased access to healthcare services in the country. The other interesting point, which is on the right-hand side, is the sources. How equitable is the financing of the health sector in Thailand? So in general, although the private health sector is highly active in Thailand, the health system in the country is primarily financed through taxation. The level of priority placed on health by the government is measured by the government spending as percentage of current health expenditures, which has increased from 63% in 2005 to 70.4% in 2020. The other interesting point is that the level of out-of-pocket expenditure is slowly decreasing, which means that there is higher equity of financing of the health system and less burden on the financial burden on the population, especially the poor ones.
On decentralization for health, well, I think the first bullets kind of repeat what I already said in terms of access to data. It was a bit a challenge, but at least for the countries where we had the data, I think the picture varies very much from country to country, depending on your administrative apparatus and the relationship from the Ministry of Health with all the health services providers. Usually hospitals are managed from some central level, even those that are at district level. In Timor-Leste, we've seen also the increasing number of regional health authorities that shows basically the willingness to move towards decentralization on health. Looking at the expenditure side, I mean, China is, again, the most decentralized one with almost 99% of their expenditure for the subnational level in the health sector. Vietnam, interesting to compare, remains very high, over 82%, which still is 10% less than what Vietnam does for education. Indonesia and Mongolia have pretty stable allocation over the year, which are, well, around 25% for Indonesia and 12% for Mongolia. Laos, again, has a bit of volatility in terms of allocation. It varies from 60% up to down 40%. Now, looking at the social protection, which is the last main social sectors under review here, basically social assistance has got the highest political support, I think, during COVID. So there was a very big momentum to ensure that the most vulnerable people were protected. But here we see also from the benchmark that actually very few countries have crossed it. Overall, in the regions, we are 9.8% of government spending towards social assistance. Coverage remains still something that needs to be addressed. In terms of performance in this region, Mongolia was the champion with 33% of budget allocated to social assistance in 2021. But we see also very positive trends in Thailand, Cambodia, and China for meeting or at least allocating the sufficient resources for meeting the benchmark and expanding as well the coverage for social protection mechanism.
In terms of trends of prioritization of social protection, during the COVID period, your governments showed high political will, policy prioritization, and also budget prioritization of social protection schemes, which was also somehow sustained during the years 2021 and 2022. However, what we are seeing is a slow movement towards temporary or slow adjustment, and even in some cases, the prioritization of social protection. This trend is important to note and remember because the dynamics of poverty has led to increased poverty and vulnerability among the population, including children and their families during the COVID years, which is further augmented by natural shocks and disasters, as well as the aging population that Damien mentioned previously. So this needs to be kept in mind when prioritizing overall social protection in the envelope of the government. One good case, one case in the region that has shown consistent increase in the allocations and spending for social protection is Cambodia. And what's interesting in this case is that they have showed a combination of both investment in responses to COVID, to mitigating the inflation impacts, as well as climate shocks and disaster responses. But also they're very systematically moving towards national social protection schemes, such as the family package, which includes components for pregnant women, for children, for disabled, and for the elderly. And all of these schemes have been although they have been introduced at different moments in time over the past years, overall, they will be merged into one big scheme, which is starting as of December this year, which is the family package, and this is really a remarkable achievement for Cambodia in social protection.
On decentralized level, actually, the level of data available was limited. We had only information for 6 countries, which are Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, Mongolia, and Vietnam. Of course, here the performance and the level of funds allocated varies very much on the composition at local level. So the pictures also can be a bit distorted in that sense. China remains again with the highest decentralization level with 95% of allocation. Interestingly, for Vietnam, which has been extremely decentralized for health and education, over 80 or 90% respectively. Here we go in the range of 35 to 50% for social assistance. For the other countries that were monitored, we could see actually more than 60% managed by the central governments. So we see much more steering from the top rather than the bottom-up approach. Which brings us to the conclusion of these presentations, where basically we were presenting you, of course, all the external factors that have implemented the SDG and their ambition, where I think it remains still very high on the political agenda to achieve at least the highest performance possible towards 2030, and especially by looking at maximizing efficiency gains, prioritizing the policy area for critical investments and generated additional revenues. During the presentation, we have made special cases for Thailand education, but we could have also mentioned Malaysia, which has shown consistent prioritization of education. The same for social protection. We have mentioned now Cambodia, but we have also Mongolia, who have done great things, and on health, also Timor-Leste could have been mentioned. In general, I think it's the need for long-term growth, and we think and we believe strongly that human capital development is needed for sustained economic growth over the long term. You have introduced important fiscal measures that will need to be sustained over time just to measure progress, which hopefully will look more positive when we reach 2030. Now, this is, of course, a snapshot of what has been reviewed during 2017, 2023 up to now. You had very important external factors that have kicked in, which also may distort the picture, and we hope to have maybe a more positive outcome in the years to come. But also for the Q&A session, I think for us, it would be also very interesting to hear from you, based on your country context, how can we prioritize SDG for achieving the highest performance? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.